Hello everyone, welcome to Classical Archaeology. This video will be the first in a course on classical archaeology, and it will provide some important definitions and background that are used in archaeological inquiry. The video will begin by discussing what it means to be classical, how the term classical is defined and how it's relevant to this course. Then it will give a definition for archaeology, discussing both the popular definition and the academic definition of the field. Then it will talk about cities and urban centers, since much of the focus of this class is going to be on urban archaeology, that is, archaeological finds being made in urban centers, either abandoned urban centers or urban centers that were used in antiquity and are still being used in the present, like the city of Rome, for example. Then we'll talk about some archaeological terminology, relative versus absolute dating, and the strengths and weaknesses of these dating methods. We'll also talk about periodization and standardization as well, because oftentimes archaeologists group periods of history according to styles and patterns that are evident to modern observers today looking back at the past, but that may not have been evident to people living in ancient times. And we'll also talk about standardization of dates, standardization of units of measurement, metric system versus the English imperial system. These are things that are very important in archaeological study. And the final thing we'll talk about in the video is ethics, ethical issues related to archaeology. Things like stakeholders, what people are involved in archaeological digs and archaeological investigations, and how are they affected by archaeology. We'll also talk about the history of archaeology as an intellectual field, and how the field's history relates to discussions of ethics within archaeology. We'll also talk about ownership of artifacts, which has become a very controversial debate in recent years. And then we'll talk about bias at the end of the video, and the question of bias in the field of archaeology, before we come to our conclusion. First, let's discuss what it means to be classical. The Oxford English Dictionary uses two definitions for the term classical. The first is of, relating to, or characteristic of Greek or Roman antiquity. The second definition comes from the Latin word classicus, which means representative or exemplary of a class of things. We're going to use the first definition in this course, as the main focus of this class is the exploration of the Greek and Roman civilizations through the study of their archaeological remains. The second definition is also useful and relevant to us, as many elements of so-called Western and United States culture have used Greco-Roman civilizations as an example and a guide. Some examples can be found on this slide. The Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., like most other United States monumental architecture, is built in a neoclassical style. Note its dome and its columns and its pediment. Also note this statue of George Washington wearing a toga. Washington never would have worn a toga during his life, but because of the fascination that Americans have had with the classical civilizations, they've depicted the father of our country wearing ancient Roman garb. Archaeology came into its own as an academic field in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Originally, archaeology was the description and study of objects, monuments, works of art, etc., from the ancient past. It was also the study of the collective artifacts, burials, structures, and other material remains of a particular people in the past, locality, period, etc., recovered through excavation and the study of archaeological remains. Archaeology as a field has evolved significantly since its founding over 100 years ago. Nowadays, archaeology is the study of past peoples, societies, and cultures through the systematic excavation, recording, and analysis of artifacts, burials, structures, and other material remains. In other words, the study of past peoples is at the center of the field, rather than the artifacts themselves, as was the case over 100 years ago, and during the early 20th century, as revealed by many films and other types of media that depict the field of archaeology. Popular culture and the general public often have a very different view of archaeology than the one held by professional archaeologists. Popular culture generally has a very romanticized view of archaeology. Popular culture often depicts archaeology as being about artifact collecting for the sake of collection, rather than artifact collecting for the sake of learning more about ancient civilizations. In addition, popular culture often assigns supernatural powers to artifacts. Lastly, popular culture, especially in film, likes to depict archaeologists in the past rather than the present. Eras like the 1920s and 1930s are especially popular. The field of archaeology was somewhat less professionalized in the 1920s and 1930s, although archaeology, even 100 years ago, was far more academic and far more professional than these films would like to suggest. In reality, archaeology is often a very slow, methodical, even painstaking process. Archaeologists carefully use hand tools like brushes and sieves to sift through layers of earth or strata. Then they carefully divide their sites into grids to help them keep track of the artifacts they unearth. In the past, difficulties have often arisen over ownership of artifacts that have been uncovered. In recent years, they generally do not rise to the level of acrimony seen in media like the fictional Indiana Jones films, in which the protagonist fights for artifacts against people like the Nazis, for example. In the past, archaeologists often fought over ownership of artifacts they found with local governments, but it rarely escalated to the level we see in films. Archaeology is an interdisciplinary academic field. It borrows perspectives, theory, and methodology from a variety of other academic disciplines. Some academic disciplines that archaeology borrows perspectives from include anthropology, chemistry, ethnography, folklore studies, history, philology, too many others to list. Archaeology and archaeologists use a variety of sources, including both artifacts and written texts stored in libraries and archives, to explore the past. Archaeologists analyze the artifacts they have unearthed in laboratories, where they identify them, reconstruct them, determine their ownership and original use, and, if necessary, preserve them. Archaeologists use artifacts, also known as material objects or material culture, to answer questions about past civilizations that are left unanswered by written sources. In this course, we'll take a broad, holistic perspective on artifacts/material culture/material objects. Material objects that are useful to archaeologists can be small, like a potsherd, or large, like a building. Material culture and material objects can often bridge the gap between artifacts and material sources. For example, potsherds, material objects, often had written inscriptions, being used by ancient people as a material for writing down notes, similar to how people scribble notes and shopping lists on scrap pieces of paper today. Natural materials like seeds, animal bones, and even human remains will also be considered material culture in this course. All of these material sources, though different from each other, are useful and can help archaeologists learn about the past in ways that are impossible using only written sources. The focus of this course, or the approach that we're going to take to studying artifacts from the classical civilizations, is a urban and historical archaeological approach. So we'll be talking about artifacts that are found primarily in the classical urban centers, cities like Rome, for example, or Athens. And we'll be using the artifacts we find to fill in gaps in the historical record. And the historical record is dominated by documentary sources, that is, written sources. And written sources, of course, come in a variety of forms. Written sources have different goals. They have different perspectives. The authors who write sources have their own biases, which is, of course, why we bring in artifacts as well. Because artifacts, unlike people, don't lie. Artifacts, though, can be misinterpreted, so it's important to use as many sources as possible, study multiple kinds of artifacts, and then use documentary sources as well to try to portray as complete of a picture of the past as possible. And archaeologists like to look at cities and like to do archaeology in cities because urban centers have a higher population density, which means you're more likely to find more artifacts, and basically your archaeological research is going to pay off much more in a city than if you're just digging in a area that has always been rural. And of course, you could also be digging in an area that used to be a bustling city, but now is a desolate, deserted area. Although in some cases, when you're doing urban archaeology of a ancient city, there's often a modern city on top of that ancient city, like the city of Rome, for example. We'll talk about issues related to modern people later on in the video. Cities are also interesting, though, because they're often the primary driver of a civilization's cultural output, because they have the highest population density, they have the most people who can work together on projects. There can be greater resource surpluses when you have more people coming together. And of course, studying cities in the past can also help us to better understand cities in the present. Here are some important definitions and terminology related to cities. We get our English word city from the Latin word civitas, which means community. The Romans called cities urbs, which is where we get our word urban from. And we'll be using the terminology of archaeologist V. Gordon Childe. Childe was an archaeologist back in the 1950s, and he listed about 10 characteristics of cities. A city had to have these things. They had to meet these 10 criteria in order to be considered a true urban center. In recent years, people have argued that Childe's definition of a city doesn't really apply outside of the Mediterranean core, as it's often called. Basically, Mediterranean Europe, Egypt, North Africa, and sort of the Near East. But I still think using Childe's terminology, keeping it in mind, I think it'd still be helpful. But we'll talk a bit more about the issue of bias later in the video. But to simplify Childe's parameters, we'll say that basically a city is a large permanent settlement that has enough residents to possess division of labor, to store resources, and develop and export a culture to surrounding localities. What kind of sources do archaeologists use to study ancient cities? Well, they can consider the buildings of ancient cities. Some buildings from ancient cities are still in use, like the Pantheon in Rome. They can also use buildings that are no longer being used in their intended manner, like the Great Pyramid of Giza, which was once a tomb, but is now a historical/tourist site. Archaeologists also can use smaller artifacts recovered from ruins/excavation sites. These smaller artifacts can be things that the inhabitants of ancient cities want to preserve, like artwork, or it can be items that were used in their daily life that were not meant to be preserved, like pot shards, animal bones, broken tools, and much more. Additionally, archaeologists can use ethnography to learn about ancient cities. They can study present-day people who are descendants of the residents of the ancient city/culture that they are trying to recreate. Ethnography, though, can be inaccurate due to things like the migrations of people, changing trade networks, and because progress is not strictly linear. Now that we've discussed what archaeology is as a field and what sources archaeologists use, we can now go over some archaeological terminology. We'll start with dating methods. There are two major dating methods that archaeologists use to establish chronologies of the artifacts they find. These are relative dating and absolute dating. Relative dating says artifact X is older than artifact Y. Absolute dating says artifact X is this many years old. Both dating methods are useful, but both dating methods have their limitations. As such, archaeologists use both relative and absolute dating to establish chronologies for the artifacts they discover. We'll begin our discussion of relative dating by talking about seriation, which is one of the most common forms of relative dating used by archaeologists. And seriation basically notes differences between groups or categories of artifacts. For example, automobiles, see below. An archaeologist living 1,000, 2,000 years from now might dig up long abandoned automobiles and try to classify them and identify which one is the oldest and which one is the newest. There are some core assumptions of seriation. Basically, the assumption is that the more sophisticated artifacts will be newer as craftspeople become more skilled in their techniques over time, and as a civilization advances and adds to the sum total of its knowledge, that civilization can make better artifacts that are more sophisticated, more technologically advanced. There are some limitations to seriation, however. For example, just as civilizations rise, they fall, and as civilizations decline, oftentimes their material culture becomes less sophisticated, less advanced, and just of a lower quality. The civilization being short on resources, facing external and internal threats, it will often just produce objects that are not as good as those were made by their predecessors. And this actually leads to a very old but very important kind of expression or truism in archaeology, and that is pots aren't people. You can learn a lot about a culture by studying the objects it leaves behind, but you have to study lots of other things as well. You have to also study their human remains. You have to study documentary sources if they've left anything behind. Basically, seriation has some limitations. Other limitations are archaeologists simply might misclassify artifacts. They might take two different types of artifacts and assume that they are the same thing. They might assume, for example, that a clay oil lamp is actually a pot because it's made from the same material as a pot. They're both made from clay. even though an oil lamp and a pot are used for very different things. An oil lamp is used for lighting, and then a pot is used for storage. And again, the image on this slide is a diagram showing seriation with the Honda Accord automobile. And the least sophisticated, boxiest, simplest example of a Honda Accord is the oldest from 1981. And then the most sophisticated, most rounded, most curved model is from 2014. So in this case, if you didn't have these dates here, you could use seriation to reason that this is the oldest model and this is the newest model. But seriation has its limits, and that's why archaeologists use other relative and absolute dating methods when they're classifying artifacts. Here are some examples that show the limits of seriation. On the right example, we see two statues of a fertility goddess known as Venus. On the left is the Venus de Milo, which was sculpted around roughly 150 to 125 BCE. Further to the right, we see the Venus of Willendorf, sculpted roughly 23,000 BCE. In this case, seriation works because the more technically sophisticated artifact is much more recent. However, in our left example, we see the artifact that displays a lower level of technical sophistication. The scream was created much more recently than the artifact with a higher level of technical sophistication, the Mona Lisa. By the way, I'm not saying that modern art is bad. I'm just saying that the level of brushstrokes and sophistication on canvas is much simpler, highlighting that seriation does not always prove accurate. Now we'll discuss another relative dating method used by archaeologists called stratigraphy. Stratigraphy considers layers of earth, known as strata, and the artifacts contained in each layer. Stratigraphy assumes that artifacts in higher layers are more recent than those found in lower layers. There are, however, some limitations to stratigraphy. Layers of strata can be disturbed by large-scale natural disasters, like floods or earthquakes. Layers can also be disturbed by human excavation. See the diagram here, how a medieval pit cuts through several different layers of strata, even though the pit was created during one period. Additionally, layers of strata can be very unclear, far more unclear than they are in this diagram. Additionally, layers of strata may be deposited at different rates, which is why stratigraphy is a relative dating method. It helps archaeologists estimate which artifacts are older than others and which artifacts are more recent. Here are a couple of examples that highlight the limitations of stratigraphy, namely how layers of strata are not always chronologically on top of one another, with the newest layers being on top and the oldest layers being at the bottom. Sometimes, as can be seen on the left-hand side of this slide, one layer of strata will cut through multiple other layers, making stratigraphy very difficult to use. Now we'll talk a little bit about absolute dating. With absolute dating, archaeologists can assign dates to the artifacts they find. But as was the case with relative dating, there are limits to the absolute dating methods that archaeologists use. The first absolute dating method we'll discuss is called dendrochronology. Dendrochronology gets its name from the Greek word dendron, meaning tree, and chronology, meaning study of time. Dendrochronology counts tree rings to determine the age of a tree or the age of a wooden artifact where tree rings are evident. Larger rings denote rainier years, in which the trees grew more. There are, of course, some limitations with dendrochronology. Some trees have very long life cycles of centuries, even millennia. Other trees only live for a few years. In addition, artisans in the past may have used a tree that had been dead for centuries to make the objects that archaeologists have discovered. So, when an archaeologist uses dendrochronology to decide the age of a wooden object, they are assuming that the past person who made this object immediately cut down the tree and fashioned the object that the archaeologist found. The second absolute dating method we'll discuss in this course involves archaeologists' use of historical documentary sources. Scholars in ancient times recorded historical events that were of significance and dated them using repeatable astronomical observations, such as the passing of a comet or the position of a star or planet in the night sky. Here are a few notable historical chronologies that are used by archaeologists. They include Manetho's Egyptian dynastic chronology from the 3rd century BCE, the Babylonian and Hebrew biblical chronologies, and then the Julian/Gregorian calendar, which gave us the BC and CE dating systems, which are still in use. Archaeologists will use multiple chronologies together to assign dates to historical events and to date the material objects they find. There are, of course, some limitations with using these ancient documentary sources. Ancient authors were not always precise in their astronomical observations. They didn't say where they were when they observed the star Sirius in the night sky, for example. In addition, not all chronologies were meant to be taken literally. The third absolute dating method we'll discuss in this course is atomic radiocarbon-14 dating. Carbon-14 dating was developed after the Second World War by Willard Libby of the University of Chicago. Carbon-14 dating works by measuring how long it takes for carbon-14 isotopes to lose their extra neutrons to become regular carbon-12, as you can see in the atomic model on the left-hand side of this slide. Carbon atoms gain extra neutrons from solar radiation. Like the other relative and absolute dating methods discussed in this video, carbon-14 dating has its limitations. When used correctly, carbon-14 dating can be fairly accurate, but it is not always precise. As precision increases, the chance of accuracy decreases when using carbon dating. Additionally, carbon-14 dating can only be used on artifacts that contain large amounts of carbon, primarily natural materials like bones or wood, although carbon-14 could theoretically be used on an item made of high-carbon steel. Carbon-14 dating is also unreliable when used on living objects, like live trees, as a living thing will replenish its cells and regrow its cells and take on additional carbon-14. Carbon-14 dating can also only be used on objects that are less than 50,000 years old, and the method becomes increasingly unreliable on artifacts that are more than 37,000 years old. Carbon-14 dating also assumes that the decay or breakdown of carbon-14 has occurred at a constant rate throughout time. Lastly, carbon-14 dating assumes that the depositing of carbon-14 from solar radiation has been relatively constant throughout Earth's history. Scholars argue that at certain points in human history, solar radiation was higher, meaning theoretically that the deposit of carbon-14 was higher at certain points in Earth's history. This would make some objects seem to be far more recent than they actually are. Because of the limitations endemic to each of the aforementioned relative and absolute dating methods, good archaeologists will use a combination of these chronological techniques to date their finds. Archaeologists will also use terms like circa, from the Latin word circum, meaning ring or roundabout, to indicate that their dates are estimates. Additionally, archaeologists will revise their work in light of new discoveries. In addition to dating artifacts through absolute and relative methods, archaeologists will organize their finds by periods. Some of the periods that we will use in this course include the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, along with periods like the Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic periods for ancient Greece, and then the Republican and Imperial periods for ancient Rome. Just like the dating methods we discussed previously, periodization has its limitations as well. There are limits when using technology-based periodization, like the Bronze Age or the Neolithic Age. Not all cultures adopt a technology at the same time, and some cultures do not adopt a technology at all. For example, the Bronze Age occurred from roughly 3300 to 3000 BCE, varying by region and civilization. And not all civilizations used bronze tools. Some civilizations went from the Stone Age right into the Iron Age. There are also issues with culture-based periods. Culture-based periodization is teleological. These periods were set up by archaeologists for the purpose of categorizing archaeological finds. The people of the past who would have lived in these periods would not have classified their civilizations in the same way. For example, ancient Greeks living during the Archaic period from about 800 to 480 BCE would not have referred to themselves as the Archaic Greeks. They would have said, what makes them archaic? They are the Greeks of the present. Keep in mind that they probably would not have referred to themselves as Greeks, but rather by the city-state they were living in, Athenians, Spartans, etc. On the right-hand side of this slide, we can see an example of the limitations of periodization. The top image is of two bronze swords from the ancient Mediterranean from about the 17th century BCE. The bottom image is of a bronze sword from China from about the 6th to the 5th century BCE. These are both bronze swords, but they were made over 1,000 years apart. So saying that they are both Bronze Age, while correct, is not very helpful. Before we move on to our final section of this video, ethics in archaeology, I want to talk about dates and measurements because this is an important part of standardization and using terminology that archaeologists and scholars around the world will understand. Generally speaking, archaeologists measure time using the 365.25 day year, using the designations BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, Latin for Year of Our Lord, or after the birth of Christ, to date things in time. Now, there are some countries that don't use the BC AD dating system. They date events from other things in history. But the BC AD birth of Christ dating method is the most commonly used. Now, the dates don't add up perfectly in the birth of Christ dating system, because the year is slightly longer than 365 days. This is why we have leap years. One year every 4 years has 366 days. And the Christian monks who were setting up the Christian calendar, they made some miscalculations about exactly when Christ was born and about how long the year was. And that's why sometimes Jesus Christ's birth is dated not at AD 1, but at somewhere between the years 3 and 8 BC. Also, many scholars like to use the term BCE, before Common Era, and CE, Common Era, to try to be more inclusive of cultures that don't practice Christianity. They're still dating things, though, from the birth of Christ. Instead of using BC AD, they're using BCE CE. And, of course, students of all faiths and all backgrounds are welcome in this course and may use whatever dating terminology they wish. They should just be consistent. Don't switch between BCE and BC or CE and AD. And regarding measurements of distance and of volume and mass, students may use the metric system or the English and imperial system. Just, again, be consistent. But now, on to our discussion of ethics in archaeology. Now we'll talk about some ethical issues related to the field of archaeology. And the first ethical issue we'll discuss is the issue of stakeholders. Many people are going to be affected by archaeological investigations, and all people will have differing, often divergent concerns and goals for archaeological digs and archaeological study. The first group of stakeholders are the archaeologists themselves. Their goals and concerns are going to be discovering as much about the past as possible, conducting research, preserving archaeological finds, and then securing funding for future digs and excavations. The second group of stakeholders are landowners or property owners, people who own the land on which these archaeological excavations are taking place. And they're going to want excavations done quickly so that the land, their property, can be used for the purposes they want, for agriculture, development, construction, industry, etc. Archaeological digs, of course, would disrupt the landowner's use of their land. The third group of stakeholders are local people, and local people living in or around the archaeological site. They may or may not be interested in the excavation. Any artifacts that are recovered, they may want to keep in their communities to draw tourism, to bolster the local economy. At the same time, they may also find archaeological digs to be a disruptive nuisance to their daily affairs. Archaeologists are in the way, they're digging things up, they can't move around the way they would like to. And in some cases, local people may be hostile to archaeological digs because they're hostile to past peoples, the people that were on this land before they were. And the final group we'll talk about are descendants of the civilizations being investigated. And in many cases, the local people and descendants of the past cultures, the past civilizations, there's overlap. Local people living on an archaeological site could be the descendants of the civilization or the people who are being investigated by the archaeologists. In fact, all four of these stakeholders, there can be overlap. A landowner is probably going to be a local person. That landowner might also be a descendant of the people that are being investigated. Also nowadays, archaeologists from around the world work on dig sites, and they often try to bring in local archaeologists, local scholars. So there can be some overlap in these four groups. And successful archaeological excavations are going to balance the concerns and goals of all of these stakeholders and try to make everyone as content as possible. But that's not always an easy thing. And so here are some images on the slide. From the left, these are the skeletal remains of English King Richard III, who lived in the 1400s. His remains were actually found during a parking garage construction project in the UK about the year 2012. And it's an interesting site because documentary sources talked about Richard III having unusual deformities, having almost like a hunchback. And initially it was thought that this was just anti-Richard propaganda made up by later English people who didn't like him. But this archaeological study and investigation for his remains revealed that he did in fact have a very serious case of scoliosis, which is maybe why people said that he had a hunchback. On the next image is Coptic Egyptian people. The Coptic people are a people that live in Egypt. They're generally Christian, but they're also very interested in Egyptian culture, and they share genetic ancestry with the ancient Egyptians. And this is an image, I think it's actually of American Coptic Egyptians, but you can see their Christian religion, but they're also their love for ancient Egyptian culture and these not very authentic Egyptian costumes. Also, Arab Egyptians have significant relations to ancient Egyptians as well, and Arab Egyptians also are interested in ancient Egyptian artifacts and ancient Egyptian culture as well. So Coptic and Arab Egyptians, they fall into the local people and the descendants of civilizations being investigated categories. On the more negative side, though, there are groups of local people who have some ties to past civilizations who are not interested in artifacts, and in fact are hostile to these artifacts and to past cultures and past peoples that are different than they are. I won't name the groups of these people. I don't want to give them attention. But in this image here, you can see a group of people smashing up some Assyrian artifacts in the Nineveh Museum about the year 2015. And then on the far right, you can see a statue of the Buddha. It was built sometime in the 6th to 7th century CE, destroyed by another group of people that did not like cultures that were different than they were. So in some cases, people are really interested and excited about archaeology and archaeological digs. They want to take ownership of artifacts because they recognize those artifacts are the property of their ancestors. In other cases, though, there's people who are hostile to archaeological digs. They don't like the people that are being investigated. They don't like people that are different than them. So this is just to illustrate how difficult navigating and dealing with stakeholders can be for an archaeologist. The second point I wanted to make about archaeology and ethics in archaeology is related to the history of archaeology as an intellectual field. And people have always had an interest in the past. I think it's a part of being human. And one way that people have learned about the past is by finding and collecting artifacts. And people have been collecting artifacts for centuries. They've been collecting artifacts since antiquity. And in the past, this collection of artifacts was a mix of treasure hunting, finding artifacts that are valuable, and also antiquarianism, basically the study of things that are old and in the past. About the 1800s, though, the first references to archaeologists are being made in print, and the field is going to really professionalize in the late 1800s and early 1900s. William Flinders Petrie, who lived from the 1850s to the 1940s, he's considered by many to be the father of archaeology. And you can see him on the right-hand side of this slide. And Petrie was from the UK, but he did archaeological research in the Middle East, especially in Egypt. And by many, he's considered to be the father of archaeology because of various archaeological methods and techniques that are still being used today he developed. And he really helped to professionalize the field in many ways. Although the field was professionalizing in the late 1800s and early 1900s, archaeologists of this period, including Petrie himself, were very much products of their time. There was a degree of Eurocentrism in their understanding of the past. I don't believe that archaeology is entirely Eurocentric, but people like William Flinders Petrie certainly were Eurocentric, especially Northern European or Northern Eurocentric. Petrie held ideas that he believed that Northern Europeans were superior to Mediterranean Europeans, and that Northern Europeans especially, were also superior to North Africans and Middle Eastern people. Basically, ideas that we would consider racist today. And unfortunately, Petrie's racist ideas impacted his conclusions, particularly about the Egyptian civilization. But Petrie still made some very important discoveries and really helped to create the field of archaeology. So we'll keep the good, but leave the bad behind. But we'll talk about bias a little bit more in a few minutes. And the image on the left-hand side of the slide is actually a pyramid, or it's the tomb of Gaius Cestius. It was built between 18 and 12 BCE in Rome. And Cestius was Roman, but he was very interested in Egypt. You might say that even in ancient times, he's kind of a proto-Egyptologist or a proto-archaeologist of ancient Egypt. Now, obviously, he was not a professional archaeologist, but he was very interested in the past. And this just highlights that people all across history have been fascinated by the past. Another interesting thing to note about Cestius is he lives right around the birth of Christ, just over 2,000 years ago from the present day. But he's having a pyramid built for himself. And the Great Pyramids of Giza, the most famous of the Egyptian pyramids, they were built about 2500 BCE or so. So Cestius, even though he lives in ancient times and having a pyramid tomb built for himself, he's closer to us today in time than he is to the actual famous Great Pyramids in Egypt, which is a really interesting and kind of crazy thing to think about. The third issue we'll talk about related to ethics and archaeology is the artifact repatriation, artifact return debate. This has been really hotly contested in recent years. People have talked about what should be done with artifacts that are in museums. People in archaeology and museum studies will debate these points. And these debates, as you can imagine, can get very heated. They discuss whether artifacts taken from other countries or other regions should be returned, should be taken out of museums and sent back to the regions and countries and peoples where they were found. In the past, archaeologists generally came from parts of Europe, especially Northern Europe, and also the United States, and they, generally speaking, would want to take those artifacts back to their home countries, in some cases against the wishes or against the laws of local people who lived in and around the sites that they were investigating. So the question, of course, is why would they do this? Well, the people, the archaeologists, and then the people and institutions that funded them, universities, private individuals, etc., wanted to possess the artifacts that they were paying the archaeologists to find. But there's also, I think, a degree of racism in many cases against local non-European people. Might have informed these archaeologists and these external funding sources' decisions to move these artifacts away from where they were found and back to places like Western Europe and the United States. People in the 19th century, Northern European people often regarded Southern European and North African and Middle Eastern people as racially beneath them and not sophisticated enough to take care of these priceless artifacts. To make things a little bit more complicated, many of the places that these archaeologists were digging were colonies of countries in Western or Northern Europe. So colonialism is also could be a factor here in some cases. I think one of the most interesting and contentious debates that's happening right now involves some artifacts taken from Greece during the Ottoman Turkish rule of Greece. Lord Elgin, seen here, was a British diplomat or ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and he took a series of statues and friezes, basically carved reliefs, away from the Parthenon site in Athens and took them back to the United Kingdom, and they're currently in the British Museum. At this time, Greece was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Greece does not get its independence until the 1830s. Elgin claimed that he had a document from the Ottomans that gave him permission to remove these artifacts in exchange for some repair work on the Parthenon site that Elgin was going to pay for himself. The Parthenon site had been heavily damaged over the years. It had been damaged because the Ottomans had stored gunpowder in the Parthenon, and then that gunpowder was, some of it was ignited by an attack from Venice, for example. This is happening in the 1600s. So in the early 1800s, Elgin claimed that in exchange for some repair work he was doing for the Ottomans were allowing him to take some statues and things, some marble carvings out of the Parthenon. Although the original document, the original Turkish document that claims this, has not been found. But nowadays, Greece claims that these artifacts were taken unfairly. They claim that the Ottoman Empire had no right to give the British authority to take these artifacts away. There's a lot of animosity between Turks and Greeks and Turks. The Ottoman Empire, conquered Greece and ruled over Greece. The Ottoman Empire was Islamic, Muslim. The Greeks were primarily Christian. And the Ottomans were not super interested in taking artifacts and putting them in their own museums. They were much more interested in taking sites and transforming them for other uses. They might take a church or a temple and turn it into a mosque, for example. Usually if the building was abandoned, but not always. Sometimes these were active buildings that were converted for other purposes against the Greek people's wishes. But this debate is ongoing and will likely continue for many years to come. Nowadays, though, archaeology is much more concerned with studying past civilizations than it is about recovering artifacts and moving them to museums. Also, academic beliefs about race and ethnicity have changed. People of non-Northern European descent are not looked down upon the way they might have been in the past. So archaeologists, when they go into a country, if they're not from that country, they will partner with local museums and local and indigenous archaeologists to recover artifacts and then have them placed in museums in the countries where they've been found. Or in some cases, they'll just leave the artifacts in situ where they are because that's the best way to preserve them, rather than trying to move them and possibly risking damaging them. So with this background in mind, we can discuss whether artifacts should be repatriated, which artifacts should be repatriated. Certainly, local and indigenous peoples would benefit from having these artifacts returned to them. These may be their ancestors' property, or just having these artifacts back in their country could be a boost to tourism, could be a boost to local culture. But there are concerns as well. Certainly, shipping very fragile artifacts back could lead to these artifacts being further damaged, perhaps permanently damaged. And of course, there's also concern about repatriating artifacts to more unstable, politically unstable parts of the world. An artifact may be safe in its current location, but it may not be safe if it is returned. Ultimately, though, I'll leave that up to you, the viewer, to decide where you stand on the issue of repatriation of artifacts. Everyone is going to have a different opinion about this very contentious issue. And the final point we'll make about ethics and archaeology, before we go on to the conclusion, is the question of bias. All human beings have a bias, a preference for their own beliefs and preconceived notions, but good scholars will either overcome their biases based on new discoveries and new knowledge, or they will at least not allow them to define and influence their work. Some, however, argue that bias is not an individual problem. It's not a case of a person having a bias, but rather they would argue that biases are institutional, and that entire academic fields, like archaeology, will carry on the various biases of their founders. People like William Flinders Petrie had ideas that we would consider to be racist today that we would not consider to be appropriate today, that his ideas have created the field of archaeology, and that because of that, archaeology needs to be completely redefined to get away from the views of its founders, views that we would not support today. And because of that, some argue that archaeology as an academic field is innately Eurocentric and even racist, and that the field just has to be basically realigned and reformed to combat these biases. There are some problems with this, though. I don't think that archaeology is specifically Eurocentric. I think it's much more Mediterranean-centric. For example, many Northern European cultures were and often are overlooked and regarded as being less civilized than Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures. They've been unfairly neglected, just as sub-Saharan African cultures, Asian cultures beyond the Middle East, indigenous American cultures. Archaeologists were most interested in these sort of Mediterranean cultures in the past. And so I think the real issue is the Mediterranean-centeredness of the field of archaeology. And another problem that comes with trying to combat biases is that in an attempt to fight biases that we would not agree with anymore, that we would see as being unfair, or that we would see as being regressive, bigoted, etc., we can end up creating new biases in our revisionism, in our attempt to revise the past. And basically the pendulum could swing too far in a different direction. You might switch from one kind of chauvinistic scholarship all the way to another kind of chauvinistic scholarship. It's basically a swinging pendulum. You want to try to keep things in the middle. You don't want to overcorrect. But now we'll go on to the conclusion of this video. Conclusion. At present, archaeology as an academic discipline answers questions about past civilizations, primarily through the analysis of artifacts that those civilizations have left behind, what we call material culture. Archaeology has evolved significantly over the last century or so, as archaeologists have redefined the goals of their field. They've professionalized their field. They've changed some of their approaches to artifacts, particularly to the ownership of artifacts. And archaeology, at its best, is an interdisciplinary field, learning from a lot of other academic fields and types of scholarship, and they'll draw perspectives from a variety of other academic subjects. Ancient urban sites, cities, are of particular interest to archaeologists because of the volume of artifacts that an archaeologist will find in a city site, and because cities will present a microcosm of the civilizations the archaeologist is trying to study. And archaeologists will categorize and date their artifacts through a variety of methods, both relative and absolute, to chronologically arrange their finds. And they will also recognize that dating methods all dating methods have their limitations. And archaeologists will work to make periodization and terminology as standardized as possible, to prevent confusion, and to make their discoveries as accessible to as many people as possible, especially the general public. And lastly, archaeologists think about ethics. They think about stakeholders, the people that are going to be involved in their archaeological excavations, that will be affected by these excavations. They're also going to think about the history of the field of archaeology and how archaeology as a field has changed. They'll think about what's going to happen to the artifacts that they recover. Will those artifacts be placed in local museums, museums operated by local and indigenous people, or will these artifacts be moved to museums in other countries? And archaeologists will also be aware of the issues that come with bias, how the field has changed over time as beliefs about culture and race and ethnicity have changed with time. And archaeologists will recognize that in many ways change is good, but sometimes changes can go too far.